And now, a passage from The Huguenots of Colonial, South Carolina by Arthur Henry Hirsch, from Chapter 1, The European Background and the Beginnings in Carolina. The persecution of French Protestants and their journeys to America constitute a familiar chapter in the history of migrations. Driven from France, nurtured in England, and carried across forbidding seas, scores of thousands of refugees seeking shelter from political and religious adversity found a home in the colonies of the New World. During the last quarter of the 17th century and the first half of the 18th, great numbers of these persecuted Huguenots fled from Europe to America. Thousands of families settled at various convenient points along the Atlantic coast. South Carolina was one of their most favored retreats and became known as the home of the Huguenots in America. In this province, they made 8 settlements, 6 in and about Charlestown, 1 to the extreme south of the province, and 1 in the distant back country. The European background for the history of the Huguenots in South Carolina centers naturally in 2 events: the Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598, and the repeal of that famous decree in 1685. The Edict of Nantes was but a confirmation of various treaties and other agreements concluded between Catholics and Protestants. It presumed to cancel all past grievances and injuries. Sentences that had been imposed upon Protestants on account of their religion were annulled. The legitimacy of Protestant children settled abroad was conceded, and prisoners were set free. Wherever Catholic worship had been interrupted, it was restored. Unlimited freedom of conscience was guaranteed. Special courts were set up to administer religious cases. This solemn edict was given perpetual and irrevocable character, and when proclaimed, it was heralded as a star of promise and the beginning of a new era of historical development and religious toleration. But alas, its postulates soon lost their force, and the edict became a dead letter. In many provinces where Catholic authority was still heavily chained to medieval narrowness, and where the Protestants persisted in running risks of liberty, the force of the edict was publicly annulled. Widespread proselyting, unbridled persecution, and intemperate outrages followed. Excesses that enthusiasm can easily encourage and fanaticism accelerate, with the result that in 1685 the famous Edict of Nantes was revoked. The extensive migrations from France quickly followed. It is interesting to note, then, that 75 or 100 years before the revocation, hundreds of Protestants were leaving France on account of the opposition directed against them in local politics, because of restraints of trade and other reasons, social and political. Many of the clauses in laws and charters were in practice only dead letters. It is clear that before the repeal of the Edict of Nantes, the Huguenot leaders were forced to face the prospect of a great exodus. Employers of labor were making arrangements for a transfer of their industries to places of greater safety. These people found a welcome in all parts of Europe and America. Especially cordial was the reception in the British Isles and in America. England gave asylum to all who fled from persecution. For more than 100 years, in one way and another, she encouraged the Protestants of France. It is not strange, then, that thousands of Frenchmen sought shelter in England. So great was their number and so genuine the welcome accorded them, and so complete the tolerance, that French churches were founded and entire freedom of religion was granted them. The parish registers of the English churches contained thousands of French names, attesting to the fact that many readily identified themselves with Anglican religious bodies. Scores of these French names reappear in the records of South Carolina. Though Huguenots were heartily welcomed in the British Isles, there were a number of reasons for their emigration to America. As we shall see, English economic policy lay in the background. The British Crown had granted a patent for the Carolina region, and the proprietors wanted it inhabited. French Protestants were therefore encouraged to go to America. Here was a hardy race, skilled in numerous trades, expert in the culture of wine, silk, and oil, perturbed in spirit by persecution, inured to labor, fatigue, and privation, yet enthusiastic in religious zeal. This is the very material needed for successful colonization under adverse primitive conditions, because honorable toil is a balm to persecution, and hard work an outlet for religious zeal. They were considered admirable subjects for encouragement. Besides, it was a time when conformity to the Church of England was urged with great earnestness, and when the persecutions of Protestant dissenters in England were at their height. The strict laws against nonconformists drove many from England. Clergymen, not ordained by the Bishop of London, did not enjoy the same ecclesiastical standing as others, and to make matters worse, the possibility of a popish successor was greatly feared. It was a time, too, when competition in England was bitter and intense, especially after the Huguenot immigration. English tradesmen and craftsmen were complaining. Anxiety pressed the people on every hand. In the charity bureaus, it was equally trying. So great was the demand for poor relief that even the most deserving found it difficult to obtain aid. But besides these conditions, there were other temptations to lure them to their new home in America. America was looked upon as a place inhabited by placable natives, a place of salvation and informal life, where the children of the old races of Europe could without difficulty live in comparative innocence, free from the rigid requirements of antiquated religious limitations. Furthermore, the proprietors promised large tracts of land to their friends as inducements for booming the new colony. To all emigrants of proper quality, smaller grants were offered. The Carolina Charter promised liberty of conscience. These things at a time when dissenting bodies were persecuted in England and Protestants were driven out of France proved especially inviting to French refugees. In South Carolina, the religious sympathies of the people were aroused and the destitute were generously assisted. Subscriptions were raised to support them. Liberal allotments of land were bestowed. The poor were received with generous hospitality. The alien-born were naturalized. Privileges and immunities were granted them to induce them to remain. Generations before the first successful colonization in Carolina, French Protestants sought there a shelter from political and religious persecution. Admiral Colonial dreamed of it as a haven for destitute countrymen at a time when the coasts of Florida proper, Georgia, and the Carolinas were still vaguely designated Florida. In 1555, the first expedition under Durand de Villegagnon had landed at the mouth of the Rio Janeiro in Brazil. Here, a fort was constructed on the island that was named for the intrepid enthusiast Colonial, patron of the colony. But the small settlement was finally betrayed by Villegagnon and in time entirely failed. The second expedition, 1562, under Jean Ribault and René de Laudonnière, touched at the mouth of the St. Johns River in Florida. Here, a column of stone bearing French arms was erected. Not satisfied, the party proceeded thence up the coast to Port Royal Harbor within the bounds of the present South Carolina. Here on a small island, now called Paris Island, Charles Fort was constructed and the foundations of a colony were laid. These adventurers, however, returned to France, but the country received the name Carolina, a name later retained by English colonists. In the third expedition, which was undertaken in 1564, with Ribault and Laudonnière again in charge, Fort Carolina was built at the mouth of the St. Johns River, River May, in Florida. But this expedition, though consecrated with fervent prayer and dedicated by the blood of martyrs, was throughout doomed to disaster. The mistakes and misfortunes of earlier undertakings were repeated. The adventurers neglected the culture of the soil and yielded to the temptation of quarreling among themselves. In the end, the fort was destroyed by the Spanish, under the leadership of Pedro Menendez. Then a fierce storm broke its fury upon the coast, finishing the work of destruction which Menendez had begun. Carolina, thus occupied for this brief moment by French Protestants, relapsed into decay. The ruins of the fortifications were overrun by savages, and for nearly 100 years it gave but little promise of resuscitation. In view of such things, one need not be surprised to find that in 1629 French Protestants were once more in communication with Charles I of England for the purpose of establishing a colony in Carolina. The patent that was issued to Sir Robert Heath as sole proprietor of the region grew out of the proposals of Soubise, Duc de Fontenay, representing the Huguenots in England, the Baron de Saussay and M. de Belleville, both Frenchmen, are said to have been the originators of this fruitless design of settling French Protestants in Carolina. The promoters were so certain of the success of the enterprise that the Crown issued particular instructions respecting the creed and other matters of those who would go to the new settlements. And William Boswell, one of those interested in the undertaking, gave power of attorney to Peter Lamy to receive all his rights and profits accruing from the project. Accordingly, in 1633, a colony of French Protestants sailed for Carolina from England in the Mayflower, with Edward Kingswell, their first governor. But miscarriage in the passage landed them in Virginia instead. Owing to the carelessness or else willfulness of Samuel Vassall, the contractor, or of the captain, they got no farther. After an 8-month stay in Virginia, waiting for a vessel to take them to Carolina, Kingswell in May 1634 started for England. He ultimately received £611 from Vassall and Andrews for damages and losses. What became of the families that remained is not known. Records of similar attempts are found in the years that follow, good examples of which are such efforts as those of 1663, 1670, 1677, 1687, etc. In 1663, when Charles II granted all of the area comprised in the two Carolinas to a company of English gentlemen, and the lots in Charlestown were distributed, 3 men whose names seem to be French, Richard Baton, Richard Deos, and Jacques Jour, were invested as free tenants and given all of the rights of English subjects. In the records that survive are found individual grants to Jean Bouillon in 1677, to John Bazant in 1678, to Richard Gaillard in 1678, and to Mary Baton in 1683. Possibly some or all of these were persecuted French Protestants, though the complete evidence to support such a conclusion is wanting. In January 1670, the ship Carolina, which was one of a fleet of 3 sailing from London carrying Huguenots, arrived in Carolina. This enterprise started in 1667. After sending sail over to survey the coast, the proprietors in England had decided to found a colony in the section previously surveyed by Robert Sanford, Secretary and Chief Register for the Lords Proprietors. The colony was to be composed of emigrants from England, supplemented by additions from Barbados, Ireland, and the Bermudas. Preparations required 2 years, and in time, £120,000 in money. In 1669, 3 vessels were purchased and equipped with the purpose of settling 200 people in the new territory. Joseph West was put in charge of the fleet until it should reach Barbados, where Governor Sale was to take command. On August 17, 1669, the 3 vessels, the frigate Carolina, the Port Royal, and the sloop Albemarle, were at rest in the Downs. The Carolina contained 93 passengers and supplies of all kinds ready for the sea. The list of passengers on this ship contains the names of Millicent Howe, Robert Donnet, alias Don, Abraham Phillips, and Thomas Gordon, presumably French, and all servants. The lists of passengers on the other 2 vessels are lost, but it is highly probable that they contained a number of Huguenots also bound for Carolina. These were the beginnings of permanent French colonization in Carolina. The 3 ships, after touching at points in Ireland and Barbados, headed for the American coast. The frigate Carolina reached there August 30th. The Albemarle and the Port Royal, under stress of weather, tossed on the sea some 6 weeks, and the reported lost reached harbor. The colonists settled in the country of the cacique of Kiowa, 20 leagues north of Port Royal. Dissatisfied with the location, they soon moved to a point on the Ashley River, almost directly across from the present site of Charleston. But in 1682, a second move of the seat of government was made to the neck of land formed by the confluence of the Cooper and the Ashley Rivers. Huguenots are found there when Charlestown was first laid out.